Okay, so if we're going to look at introduced species, first we better define it. So it is a species that has come from outside an area. So it's been brought into a new ecosystem. And this could be on purpose, for example, for a biological control. So farmers have brought it there to eat a pest or something like that, and it goes a little bit wrong, or by accident. So it's been stowed away. And there's lots of ways things get moved around. Flights, ships. Ships, especially, you've got obviously on the ship itself, but also you can even have it in the ballast water. So this is the water that ships have at the bottom that they take in from one harbour and they discharge somewhere else. And it's a really serious problem for moving marine species around, especially things like zebra mussels. So let's have a look at some introduced species and some examples. It's important that you can give an example to when you're answering a question on this and say what it is what it does, sort of thing. So let's start off with introduced competitors. So these are species that can outcompete a native or endemic species. And the examples are things like grey squirrels, versus red squirrels in the UK. So grey squirrels are a species that have been brought over from America by a rich Victorian who seems to quite like them and let them go in his garden. And then they sort of went on from there. They can directly outcompete red squirrels because they're larger, so that they can push them out of the way, so compete for nest sites. The other thing that they can do is exploit more food sources. So they will predate nesting birds, for example, or they can eat acorns from oak trees that native species squirrels cannot. So they have a competitive advantage. The other one is rhododendrons. Which are a beautiful evergreen plant. It's sort of a large woody shrub, and has bright, big flowers. So it's an ornamental flower shrub. Ornamental shrub. But it's invasive because it's evergreen. So it shades native species out, so it can outcompete native ground flora, so prevent native vegetation growing back up. It sort of also cheats in a way because it can produce a toxin that acts as a herbicide. So it will chemically kill off any other plant that's trying to grow underneath it, which is a neat trick when you think about it. The next one then is introduced predators. So this can result in species being suffering from more predation, and therefore having their populations suppressed, or it's a population that's never been predated before and has no adaptations to cope with predation. So things like mink, which would predate UK water voles. So mink were released from fur farms um, and escaped and bred in the wild, and they are small enough and agile enough to actually predate water voles, which not many other things naturally can. You have cane toads, which were introduced as a biological control. So they were hoping that they would eat sugarcane beetles, and they introduced it from South America, which is a very competitive environment. So it has lots of adaptations to prevent things from eating it. So it's very toxic. It produces loads of offspring. It can cope with really harsh conditions. They were rubbish at eating the pest that they brought them for, because the beetles were found at the top of the sugarcane, but the cane toads are at the bottom. But they did eat nearly everything else that they could get in their mouths, and anything that tried to eat them would then die. So it had a massive impact on lots of different parts of the food chain. So let's put everything. You've got a variety of domesticated animals, things like cats, pigs, dogs, and it's not really domesticated, but it's very closely sort of related to human habitation and activities, as rats. These were released onto oceanic islands, such as New Zealand and Australia, and small islands around them as well. So these ate all the endemic flightless birds. Things like the kea, which is a beautiful green flightless parrot from New Zealand. You have things like the Nile perch, which was introduced as a food source into Lake Victoria. And the problem is it ate a lot of indigenous fish, especially species of the cichlid, resulting in extinctions of some of those species. Another thing that introduced species can do is introduce pathogens. So one of those is like these introduced pathogens, the species that carries it usually has a natural immunity, so it's not really affected by it. But the endemic species has no immunity, and usually has a very high fatality rate as a result of it. So grey squirrels, everyone's favourite squirrel, has something called squirrel pox, which is a virus that the native red squirrels had no immunity against. So even without directly competing against the red squirrel, they could transmit this disease and cause them to die off and just occupy that empty niche. You have white-clawed crayfish are the native species, but they are vulnerable to the crayfish plague, which is a fungus. And this has been introduced by the signal crayfish, which apparently tastes delicious. That's why it was introduced into UK as a food source for fish farming. But unfortunately escaped and also carries this plague, so it directly outcompetes with the white-clawed crayfish, which is our native one, and can transmit this disease, which it has an immunity against, but the native ones do not. And another one is tree pathogens. These are typically brought in with plants that people want to plant into their garden. So horticultural products like soils or wood chippings or construction timber even, and these can introduce new pathogens into the country, so or wherever they end up. So Dutch elm disease was a really, really big thing. It's basically wiped out all the elm trees in the country in the UK, which is a pity because in some parts of the country they were a major part of forests and hedgerows and things like that. So that had a big knock-on impact to the wider ecosystem. More recently is things like ash dieback. And you've also got sudden oak death. And the last one, which I'll try and squeeze in over here, is species that hybridize. So a hybrid is two closely related species breeding, and this is a problem because it's two closely related species that naturally would never come into contact with each other. So you're sort of affecting the gene pool and the value of that offspring, because you can't really use that to continue either species then, because it's a bit of both. And the example is the red deer in the UK hybridizing with sika deer, which have been introduced. And the other big one is wildcats breeding with domestic cats. Which means that basically wildcats in this country are extinct because they're more than likely going to have hybridized some point in the recent past with a domestic cat, which is based off an Egyptian species, the desert cat, I think. So they are most of the examples and reasons you need to know about introduced species. It's one of the major threats to biodiversity on the planet at the moment. And if you're interested in any of these examples, you can just search for them on YouTube or the internet, and there's quite a lot of really interesting information about them out there.